Hey, this is Jonathan with Sojourners Awake. I wanted to take a minute today to talk about exploration in your games and a simple method I use called two questions and an action. So when I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons with my players, I used perception checks a lot. And sometimes I found myself telling players, make a perception check. I realized what I was trying to do was to get them to use their senses to explore the environment. And eventually it felt like I was just forcing them to make an action. So here's what I decided to do instead. When my sojourners arrive at a scene, uh, I will give one, two, maybe three details about the environment. Something about the smell, the sound, something that they see, and anything notable. And then I'll just go around the room and say, as you're exploring this environment, your character has two questions for the dungeon master, for the storyteller. And then, after we've gathered all the information, I would like each of you to tell me what you would like to do. And here's the reason I like this. Uh, Number one, I don't have to come up with all of the details for the world. I think Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative storytelling game. So in my games, I'm very used to handing the driver wheel over to the players and asking them to steer for a little while, especially when it comes to descriptions and world building and lore and history in the world. I've found my players are very creative, and the more I request creativity from them, the more they impress me. Another reason I like this is that it promotes active listening. So another reason I really like Dungeons and Dragons is because when people are sitting around a table, a lot of times you're chomping at the bit to get your idea, your opinion out there so that everyone else can listen to it. But the problem is if everyone does that, no one's really taking the time to listen to the other person. It's a lot of give and take. So when someone else is talking, it's the other players, including the storyteller's job, to be listening to that information. So going around the table, again, saying you have two questions to ask the dungeon master. Maybe the cleric will say, do I notice if there's any writing in the room? Well, that prompts the storyteller to then say, oh, yes, of course. And without making a perception check, without there being any level difficulty, the dungeon master then simply describes, yes, there is a small little monument giving a historical fact about this location, something amazing that happened 100 years ago. Okay. And if that's interesting, the cleric might then pursue that and say, oh, I would like to read that. What does it say? And at that point, that can be part of their action. Well, then we go around the room again, and then building on top of that, the barbarian already knows, oh yeah, I have also seen that little inscription of monuments. And it's done interesting to me. What the barbarian wants to know is, do I smell like any creatures have been around here? He takes a big smell and wants to know what the local wildlife is like. Well, if it's good for the story to have creatures nearby, the dungeon master then can say, yes, you do smell something. And then go on to describe maybe what monsters or creatures, local wildlife might be in the area. But if it doesn't serve the story, you take a deep breath, exhale, and you smell nothing except the bard who hasn't showered in a week. So going into the bard then has questions. But again, you see how after the dungeon master described the initial scene, the cleric now then helped build this little inscription monument. And the barbarian has established that there's no predators or creatures or even wildlife to hunt nearby. The bard has been having to pay attention to all that information around the table and then can build on top of that. So by the time everyone has gone around the table, when we've all used our senses and our intuition and gathered this information and built quite an amazing scene together, then the players can tell me what they would like to do. The reason I love this is because combat, there's lots of rules to combat. It's very straightforward. It can take a lot of time during the game, and it's fun. You get to use spells, you get to use your attacks, you get to help each other out and describe in vivid detail how you slay creatures and win the game. And social encounters is a little more open-ended, but again, I've seen social encounters go on and take up 30 minutes, even an hour in the game, as they're negotiating around the table, or negotiating around a dinner table, maybe at a party, or simply talking to the shopkeeper. Exploration, I feel like sometimes gets a back seat, and it's the reason it's difficult, I think, is because we don't know what's out there. We haven't used our senses. We haven't really interacted with the world. And when the dungeon master just simply says, you walk into a dusty room, there's a door, well, that's the most interesting thing. They're just going to walk right through that door. But if you take a moment and ask everyone, what is 2 things you are looking for around this room? What are 2 things you want to ask the dungeon master? Then all of a sudden that room comes to life. And that's where your story could happen. That's where the exciting encounters can take place. If the 2 questions and an action don't work, think of it this way. You could also ask your players, what is your character choosing to focus on in this room? Now, the dungeon master simply described a dusty room with a door. Well, the cleric could say, I am choosing to focus on taking a minute to meditate and pray because I feel like we've been traveling for so long and I'm afraid we might get lost. The barbarian could say, I'm choosing to focus on feeding us because we're running out of food. And the bard could say, I'm choosing to focus on finding out if there's any other way out of this room besides that door because I don't trust it. Well, then that gives the dungeon master a little bit more information as to what is interesting to the players. The cleric's taking the route of praying, and you might ask for a religion check on that. The barbarian's taking a moment to look for any kind of wildlife in this area. Has any creatures passed through? That gives the dungeon master an opportunity to lead them down the story as well. Yes, you do smell something, and it's straight through that door. And, the bard's choosing to focus on maybe secret rooms or anything that's out of the ordinary in this small, dusty room. That's a good opportunity for the storyteller to describe that there are footprints leading into a part of the wall that looks like it's just part of the wall, but might be a secret room. So hopefully the 2 questions and an action helps your games become helps your scenes and your settings come to life and helps you tell a story without having to do a ton of world building and lore backdrops. Again, the reason I like it is because I think Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative storytelling game, and that means everyone around the table gets time to shine, not just simply saying what their characters are going to do, but also help building the wonderful world that we're all playing in. So that's it. I hope you enjoy using the 2 questions and action method. I think it's really great, and I've found that it really takes the burden off the Dungeon Master for creating an amazing world and gives players a chance to shine in their creativity.